Your mom is the family failure. My brother told my children at dinner. My daughter started crying. I comforted her while Julian swirled his vintage wine, looking pleased with his cruelty. He mocked my rental house and my small consulting firm. He didn't know I was simply hiding. Monday morning. His partner called. The majority shareholder wants an emergency meeting. That is when my brother finally stopped laughing. He had spent years standing on a trap door I built with his own bad debt. I dropped my kids at school with a steady smile. My daughter's eyes were still puffy from the night before. I promised her that the world looked different today. As I drove toward the glass monolith of Julian's headquarters, the city felt electric. I swapped my denim jacket for a tailored charcoal blazer in the parking garage. The transformation felt like a physical weight settling. I adjusted the rearview mirror and saw a stranger staring back. Julian thought he was the lion. He was just a ghost. The lobby smelled of expensive lilies and quiet desperation. Security guards straightened their ties as I walked past the mahogany desk. They recognized the energy, even if they didn't know my face. I watched the gold floor numbers climb on the elevator screen. Each chime sounded like a hammer striking a nail. My brother was likely upstairs practicing his speech to the board. He still believed he was the architect of this empire. In reality, he was just an expensive tenant in my house. Julian was leaning against the boardroom table when I entered. He looked at me with genuine confusion and a hint of pity. He told me to leave before I embarrassed the family further. His partner, Marcus, didn't move to stop me. Marcus knew exactly whose name was on the cap table. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Julian laughed, but the sound died quickly. He saw Marcus hand me the folder. I opened the document and slid it across the polished wood. Julian's eyes darted over the incorporation papers for the holding company. He saw my signature on the line that controlled his destiny. The color drained from his face until he looked like marble. I reminded him that I had bought his debt 3 years ago to save him. He had mistaken my mercy for a lack of ambition. I played the recording of his dinner insults for the board. The silence that followed felt absolute. "You are demoted," I said, my voice cutting through his stuttered excuses. He had 30 days to vacate the company penthouse and return the leased car. He was no longer a king. He was a junior analyst reporting to the man he once called a subordinate. Julian looked at the glass walls and realized everyone was watching his fall. I checked my watch and stood up to leave. My daughter was waiting for her mother. I walked out of the room without looking back at the wreckage. The lobby was a blur of steel and light as I stepped into the afternoon. My heels clicked against the granite like a countdown. Julian was surely still staring at the empty chair in that boardroom. I reached my car and felt the heat radiating from the hood. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from Marcus. The locks on the penthouse were being changed within the hour. Julian had nowhere else to go tonight. I drove toward the park where my daughter waited for her pickup. The silence in the car felt different now. It was no longer a shield, but a weapon I had used. I saw my daughter sitting on a wooden bench near the swings. She looked small against the backdrop of the city skyline. Her eyes brightened when she spotted my sedan. She didn't know I had just dismantled her uncle's world. She only knew I was on time. We sat on the grass while she finished her homework. She asked if Uncle Julian was still mad at us. I told her that some people are afraid of the truth. She looked at the skyscrapers and asked who owned the big one. I didn't tell her it was mine yet. I watched a hawk circle the glass towers in the distance. The predator always stays silent until it strikes. Julian had never learned that lesson in his vanity. My phone rang again, vibrating against the soft turf. It was my mother, her voice high and panicked. Julian had called her weeping about a corporate coup. She demanded to know if I knew anything about the New York investors. I kept my voice flat and steady like a frozen lake. I told her business was complicated for men like Julian. She didn't suspect her quiet daughter for a single second. The family blind spot was still wide. I hung up and felt a cold drop of rain on my hand. The sky was turning a bruised purple over the suburbs. We needed to get home before the storm broke. I helped my daughter pack her bag and straightened her collar. She noticed the new intensity in my gaze. She asked why I was smiling at a storm. I told her that rain washes away the dust. Sometimes you have to clear the land to build. We reached our rental house just as the wind began to howl. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway. I saw a black SUV parked at the end of the street. It didn't belong in this neighborhood of modest yards. I realized Julian wasn't going to go quietly into his new life. He was desperate enough to follow me home. The corporate war was over, but the family feud was just beginning. I ushered my daughter inside and locked the heavy front door. I stood in the dark kitchen, watching the street through the blinds. The SUV sat idling, its headlights cutting through the rain. My brother was out there, stripped of his crown and his pride. He didn't know I was watching him from the shadows. I picked up the phone to call security. Then I saw a second figure step out of the dark vehicle. The rain lashed against the kitchen window in rhythmic sheets. I recognized the second man immediately as Julian's head of security. They were standing by the idling SUV, drenched and looking desperate. Julian gestured wildly at my porch, his face twisted in a silent scream. He didn't know I had already revoked his private security contract. They shouldn't have been there at all. I reached for my phone to alert the local police about the trespassers. The front door rattled as Julian began to hammer on the wood. My daughter gripped her math workbook and looked at me with wide eyes. I told her to go to her bedroom and stay quiet. She obeyed instantly, her small footsteps disappearing down the hallway. I felt the vibration of his fist through the floorboards. He was shouting about family loyalty and his stolen life. He sounded like a man drowning in his own shallow ego. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the safety chain engaged. The wind sprayed cold mist across my face and the tiled floor. Julian looked pathetic, his expensive silk tie ruined by the storm. He demanded I sign the company back to him right now. He claimed I was a thief who had tricked our parents. I looked past him at the security guard who seemed increasingly uneasy. The power was shifting again as the guard realized his paycheck stopped. Go home. Julian, I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. He tried to shove his foot into the door frame. I didn't flinch or pull away from his aggression. I told him the police were 3 minutes away from our street. He laughed, a jagged sound that lacked any real conviction. He thought he could still bully me into submission. He forgot that I was the one who had funded his entire lifestyle for years. The security guard finally stepped back and walked toward the car. He told Julian that this wasn't part of the job. Julian spun around, realizing he was truly alone in the rain. His bravado vanished, replaced by a raw and trembling fear. He looked back at me, begging for just one more chance. I saw the hollow man he had always been. The storm didn't care about his titles or his pride. He was nobody. I closed the door and turned the heavy deadbolt with a click. The shouting outside stopped as the SUV finally drove away. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and breathed slowly. My heart was a steady drum in the silence of the hall. I had protected my home, but the cost was rising. I walked to my daughter's room to tuck her in. She was asleep, but her laptop was open on the soft bed. I looked at the screen and saw a series of emails. She had been searching for my name in the business news. The secret I had kept for a decade was finally out. She knew her mother was the ghost who owned the city. I felt a new weight settle in my chest as I watched her. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was an heir. I realized my brother was the least of my problems. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her sleep. The laptop screen cast a pale blue glow over her face. I moved to close the device, but a specific headline caught my eye. It wasn't about the morning merger or the board meeting. It was an old article from a local business journal. It detailed the mysterious rise of a shell company 5 years ago. My daughter had highlighted the name of our family estate. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My daughter hadn't just found my name by accident tonight. She had been tracking the money for months on her own. She was smarter and more observant than I ever gave her credit for. I felt a surge of pride mixed with a sharp, cold fear. I had tried to shield her from the fire. Instead, I had taught her how to hold the match herself. I went back to the kitchen and made a pot of tea. My hands were finally steady after the long, rainy drive home. I sat at the table and opened my private bank app. The numbers stared back at me in a long, indifferent row. I began moving funds into a trust for my daughter's future. It was a silent apology for the chaos of the day. Then, my phone buzzed with an unknown caller ID. "Mila, you need to see what he did," Marcus whispered. His voice was thick with a strange, frantic sort of urgency. He sent me a link to a live video stream. I clicked it and saw the interior of the firm's lobby. Julian was sitting on the floor by the main elevators. He had a can of gasoline and a silver lighter. He wasn't trying to fight me anymore. He was trying to burn it all. I grabbed my keys and ran back to the garage. The rain had turned into a thick, blinding gray fog. I drove like a woman possessed by a vengeful spirit. The city lights were mere blurs against the wet glass. I called the fire department while weaving through the late traffic. Julian was a fool, but I didn't want his blood on my hands. He was a liability that refused to be liquidated easily. The skyscraper loomed ahead, a dark spear against the clouds. I saw the flickers of orange light behind the lobby glass. Security was frantic, unable to breach the door Julian had barricaded. I pushed through the crowd of onlookers and reached the entrance. Julian saw me through the pane and held up the lighter. He smiled with the teeth of a man who had lost everything. He flicked the small wheel and waited for me. The glass didn't shatter when the first flame caught the rug. Instead, a heavy internal shutter slammed down from the ceiling. It was an automated fire suppression system I had installed last year. Julian was trapped inside a vacuum-sealed chamber with no oxygen left. He dropped the lighter as the air began to thin out. I realized the building was protecting itself from its creator. Then, I saw Julian point toward the basement stairs. The oxygen-deprived lobby turned into a silent tomb of smoke. Julian pointed desperately toward the basement stairs before collapsing against the reinforced glass. I knew what lay beneath the foundation of this building. The central servers held every encrypted record of my acquisitions and shell companies. If he had set a secondary fire there, my digital empire would vanish. I grabbed an emergency axe from the wall and struck the manual override lever. The heavy iron shutters groaned as they began to rise slowly. I held my breath and lunged into the suffocating heat of the room. Julian was a heap of ruined silk on the marble floor. I didn't stop to check his pulse as I sprinted for the stairs. The basement air was thick with the smell of burning plastic and ozone. I reached the server room door and saw the red glow of a terminal. Someone had bypassed my biometric locks, using a physical master key. Julian was too incompetent for this level of technical sabotage. The server racks hummed with a frantic, high-pitched one I didn't recognize. I looked at the main monitor and saw a data wipe in progress. It wasn't Julian's work. The code was precise and professional. I realized my brother was merely a frantic distraction for the real thief. Marcus was nowhere to be seen on the security feeds. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline as I reached for the kill switch. The system demanded a secondary authorization from a remote, offshore device. I pulled my phone to call Marcus, but the line went dead instantly. A shadow moved near the backup generators in the corner of the room. It wasn't my brother or his partner standing in the dark. It was my daughter's tutor, a man I had trusted for 3 years. He held a tablet that mirrored the server's rapidly disappearing data. He didn't look like a teacher anymore. He looked like a soldier. He smiled and told me that Julian was always the easy target. I saw the uplink light blinking on his tablet. "Who are you working for?" I asked, my voice echoing off the cold concrete. He didn't answer but pointed at the screen, where the wipe reached 90%. I realized Julian's arson attempt was a desperate plan to stop this man. My brother hadn't been trying to burn the building down out of spite. He was trying to destroy the servers before they could be cloned. For once, Julian had tried to be a hero and failed. I had stopped the wrong fire. I tackled the tutor, sending the tablet skidding across the wet floor. We struggled in the dark, surrounded by the smell of scorched wires. He was stronger, but I was fighting for my children's future. I managed to grab a heavy cooling fan and struck his temple. He went limp, and I scrambled to retrieve the dropped tablet. The screen showed the final blocks of data being sent to a server in Switzerland. I hit the emergency purge, but the command was denied. I looked at the tablet and saw the name of the recipient. It wasn't a rival firm or a foreign government at all. The data was being sent back to my own family estate. My mother had been the one pulling the strings from the very beginning. She had used Julian's ego and my silence to map my wealth. I heard the sirens outside finally reaching the lobby doors. My brother was being loaded into an ambulance while my mother arrived. I stepped over the unconscious tutor and wiped blood from my lip. The sirens were deafening as they echoed through the elevator shaft above me. My mother stood under the flickering lobby lights, her pearls gleaming like shark teeth. She wasn't the grieving widow Julian had portrayed to the world today. She was a master of the long game who played us both. She watched the paramedics wheel Julian toward the doors with total indifference. He was just a spent pawn in her private game of chess. "You always were the clever one, Mila," she said. Her voice was as smooth as expensive silk over a blade. She didn't look at her broken son as he gasped for air. She only looked at the tablet clutched tightly in my shaking hand. I realized the tutor had been reporting to her for 3 long years. Every bedtime story and math lesson was a chance to map my assets. My mother had been a ghost in my own house. She wanted the empire I built. I looked at the screen and saw the transfer was complete. The encrypted files were now sitting on a private server in her name. She had 60% of the firm and my personal portfolio keys. I felt a wave of nausea hit me in the cold basement. My daughter was still at home, sleeping in a house she didn't own. My mother had effectively evicted us both with a few lines of code. She offered me a seat on her new board of directors. "I built this from nothing while you watched," I whispered. My voice was a rasping sound against the roar of the fans. She stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the damp, smoky air of the lobby. She told me that a daughter's only purpose was to serve the lineage. Julian was a loud distraction, but I was the true prize she wanted. She reached for the tablet, her fingers cold as ice against my skin. I pulled back and felt the weight of the axe. I realized I still held the physical override for the entire building. My mother had the data, but I still held the heavy keys. I struck the emergency terminal with the blunt end of the metal axe. The screen shattered, sending a cascade of sparks across her expensive designer shoes. The building's central core initiated a total physical lockdown of every exit. We were trapped in the basement with the smoke and the shadows. The police were pounding on the reinforced glass doors above us. "You'll go to prison for this, Mila," she hissed. Her composure finally cracked as the lights turned a deep, warning red. I told her that I would gladly share a cell with her. I had already triggered an automated send of the tutor's confession to Marcus 5 minutes ago. The game wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the blood. I watched her realization dawn as the air became thin and metallic. She had the digital keys, but the doors were physically bolted shut. We waited in silence. The elevators groaned as the power grid began to fail again. I saw the shadow of my daughter on the security monitor. She wasn't at home. She had secretly followed my car and was now standing in the lobby crowd. She held her own tablet, her face set in a mask of determination. My daughter wasn't just in hair, she was an active participant in this. She had intercepted the Swiss transfer before it reached my mother's final account. The child I tried to protect had outplayed the woman who raised me. I watched the screen as she typed a final command string. The lights in the building flickered once and then stayed bright. The iron shutters began to rise, exposing us to the cold night. My daughter looked directly into the security camera and gave a nod. She had rerouted the entire portfolio into a blind trust for herself. Neither I nor my mother had any control over the money now. The legacy was hers, and she was only 10 years old. It was perfect. My mother slumped against the marble wall, her power gone instantly. She looked at the screen and saw her own empty accounts. The silence was finally broken by the sound of the police entering. They ignored the crying Julian and headed straight for the basement stairs. I dropped the axe and raised my hands into the smoky air. I was a failure in my mother's eyes, but a queen. I had lost the money but gained a partner in my daughter. As they led me toward the police car, I saw Marcus. He was holding my daughter's hand and looking at the building. He gave me a subtle nod of respect as I passed. The Empire was safe, even if I was headed to court. I looked at the glass tower and saw the lights glowing. The fire was out, but the light was finally turned on. My daughter stood tall, watching the storm clouds move away from us. She was the only lighthouse left standing. The precinct air smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat in a plastic chair with my hands, still stained by server soot. Marcus walked through the double doors and handed a thick folder to the sergeant. The police moved with a new, respectful speed after seeing the documents inside. My mother sat across the room, her designer coat draped over a metal bench. She looked smaller without the glare of a boardroom to frame her. Her silence was heavy, a calculated retreat into a different kind of shadow. The sergeant called my name and led me into a private office. Marcus followed, his face a mask of professional exhaustion. He placed a tablet on the desk and hit a button. The screen displayed a complex web of transactions, originating from my mother's estate. She had used Julian's gambling debts to leverage his cooperation in the hack. Every move he made had been scripted by her to force my hand. Julian was a victim of her greed as much as I was. It was a tragedy written in red ink. Julian is stable, but he won't be coming back, Marcus said quietly. He explained that the board had voted to dissolve his entire partnership stake. The embezzlement charges were dropped in exchange for his full testimony against our mother. Julian had finally chosen a side when the oxygen ran out in that basement. He was broken, but he was finally free of her. I looked at the legal papers and felt no joy. The cost of winning was the total destruction of my family. The mid-scene turn came when the sergeant handed me a confiscated phone. It belonged to the tutor, and the screen was frozen on a final message. It wasn't from my mother or a rival firm in Switzerland. The sender was listed as Aurora. The same code name I used for my secret company. My daughter had been the one directing the tutor's final movements. She hadn't just intercepted the data, she had lured everyone into the lobby trap. She was the one who triggered the building's emergency lockdown. "Where is she now?" I asked, my voice trembling for the first time. Marcus pointed toward the lobby, where my daughter sat under the watchful eye of a social worker and a detective. She was eating a chocolate bar and looking perfectly calm. She had played the role of the innocent child to perfection all evening. I realized she had inherited my mother's tactical mind and my own patience. She wasn't just my heir, she was a master of the board. The power balance in my house had shifted while I was fighting fires. I walked out to the lobby and knelt before her chair. She looked up and wiped a smudge of chocolate from her chin. She asked if the business was finally settled for good. I told her that we were going home to a new life. She smiled and handed me a small, encrypted thumb drive. It contained the only master copy of the company's original source code. She had deleted the server backups before the police arrived. My daughter had effectively become the only gatekeeper of our future. My mother stood up as we prepared to leave the precinct. She tried to catch my eye, but I looked right through her. She was a ghost of a legacy that no longer existed. I led my daughter out into the cool, pre-dawn air. The rain had stopped, and the streets were glistening like polished obsidian. We walked toward my car, leaving the wreckage of the night behind us. My daughter squeezed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. She was ready. We drove in silence as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The city was waking up, unaware of the war that had just ended. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw the glass tower. It looked different in the morning light, less like a fortress. My daughter asked if we could go to the park today. I promised her we would spend the entire day in the sun. She leaned back and closed her eyes, finally acting like a child again. It was a lie. I reached for my coffee and noticed a new notification on my phone. It was an automated alert from a bank in the Cayman Islands. A massive deposit had just cleared into a secret account in my name. The amount matched the exact value of my mother's liquidated personal assets. My daughter hadn't just saved the company. She had robbed her grandmother. She had completed the transaction while I was being interrogated by the police. The micro twist was clear. My daughter was now more dangerous than me. I parked the car in our driveway as the morning mist dissolved. The house looked different now that I knew the truth. My daughter stepped out and hummed a low, sweet melody. She held the encrypted drive like a toy. I felt the cold weight of the bank alert on my phone. My own child had liquidated her grandmother before the sun rose. I realized then that I had spent years underestimating the very girl I was trying to save. Inside, the kitchen was silent and smelled of yesterday's rain. I sat at the table and watched her pour a glass of milk. She didn't look like a corporate thief or a technical prodigy. She looked like a 10-year-old child with untied shoelaces. "Mom, don't worry about the money," she said softly. Her voice lacked any trace of guilt or hesitation. She pushed the drive toward me across the wood. I saw a small scratch on the silver casing. The micro tension snapped when she opened her laptop. A live feed showed my mother sitting alone in a dim hotel room. She looked ruined. Her legacy stripped by the granddaughter she ignored. I realized my daughter had placed trackers in everyone's devices months ago. She knew every secret, every debt, and every lie we told. The power was never mine or Julian's to keep. We were just the loud distractions. She was the one who truly owned the room. I took the drive and felt its heavy, metallic density. This was the source code that defined our future empire. I asked her if she planned to run the company now. She laughed and said she just wanted to go to the park. The contrast was terrifying and beautiful at the exact same time. She had the wisdom of a predator and the heart of a child. I realized my brother was right about one thing. We were never a normal family. We spent the afternoon on the swings, just as I promised. The sun was warm on my back, but I remained alert. I watched the park entrance for black SUVs or familiar faces. My daughter jumped from her swing and landed perfectly in the dirt. She looked at me and pointed toward the street. Julian was standing there, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man seeking a very long penance. I walked toward him, leaving my daughter to play in the sand. Julian handed me a small envelope with a trembling hand. It wasn't a lawsuit or a demand for money. It was a list of all the other shell companies our mother owned. He told me that she was just the beginning of the problem. There were more people coming for the throne we now held. I turned back to look at my daughter. She was already staring at the street.